A, imagining I can project. Yes, good. And then B, these seats will all be full. More power to you. You can try, if you can't hear, waving a little bit, and we'll try the best in our power, but if we fail, then you'll need to come down. Otherwise, you're cool there. My name is Doug Hesse. I direct a writing program. I'm delighted that so many folks came out on a Monday evening when there's lots of stuff going on for another in the writing program series of discussions on various research traditions in the university and their implications for writing. And how many of you have been to one of these before? Okay, I won't belabor too much to spare you, but basically our conception in designing Write 1133 was it's a course that focuses on research. Most of you, that has meant going to the library, finding books, going to the internet, finding stuff, and writing it up. And clearly that's one important tradition in the university, but it's not the only one. There is obviously a tradition of interpretive research that, yes, looks at books and text, but also looks at paintings, and if you were here a couple of weeks ago, cemetery and gravestones, any number of artifacts. There is a qualitative tradition of research that looks at people individually and in groups, descriptively and analytically to draw some conclusions about how social systems work, what people are like, how they respond to things. And then there's the subject of tonight's talks, which has to do with quantitative research. And that is research that attempts to measure in some way the natural or social world to produce something that's susceptible to analysis by statistics, other kinds of measures, making arguments based on those. Clearly, this might be a kind of research that's associated with the physical sciences, the natural sciences, but also, as we'll see from one of our speakers tonight, the social sciences as well. And so our design was to invite a couple of colleagues from around the university, we've got 3 of them here actually, to talk about the kinds of writing and researching they do. And we've cast this fairly informally. I asked them to just share a few thoughts on perhaps a research project they're doing now, perhaps some writing that they've customarily done. Each of them will talk a few minutes, and then we'll have a chance for some discussion and conversation afterwards. And I hope you'll take advantage of that. What I've liked about this series is that it's offered me a chance, at least, to meet yet more colleagues from around the university. And in talking to folks who have been here, they've enjoyed the chance to hear about some areas of research going on at VU that otherwise they likely wouldn't have encountered. So that's enough preamble. What we'd like to do tonight is I'm going to first introduce my colleague, Professor Corinne Lengsfeld, who will talk a little bit, then we'll actually have a little bit of conversation afterwards before we excuse her to go home and see what trouble Samantha, her daughter, is in. And then I'll introduce the other speakers and we'll follow that. Professor Corinne Lengsfeld is an engineering professor, mechanical and materials engineering. She currently heads the Biofluids Laboratory, which researches the forces that, I'm reading here, hydrodynamic flows impart on particles and material surfaces. What the heck is that? Well, one of the things I looked at was that she's done research on how nebulizers work. It could be made more efficient. Particles, fluids, flow, makes sense. She's also been working, and I'm wondering, Corinne, have I heard you interviewed about the biosensors project on the local NPR station? How do you put wearable technologies in shoes and other things that can then transmit data to remote places so they can see if people like me have done their 10,000 steps? I haven't today. Professor Lengsfeld is the author of a couple of dozen articles and over 50 conference presentations. Here she is.
Okay, so I took a different approach than maybe they wanted me to. I sat down and I thought, What was the one writing skill that I really needed when I left college and no one talked to me about it at all? At all. Never a peep. Okay? You've done lab reports, you've done literature researches, you've done journal writing, newsprint writing, commentaries, resumes, cover letters. There's probably a few others out there. Most of those didn't actually generate income. They may have been, you had to deliver it to justify what you got, but it actually didn't bring new money in the door. So I generate somewhere between $700 and $1 million per year in research funding. So I write a lot to bring in that money, okay? So how do you do this? How do you write something to bring new income in the door, right? And I don't care if you're a scientific researcher or if you're in the arts, okay? Opposite ends of the spectrum. Everybody else is in between. You can write grants or proposals to win grants from philanthropic organizations, state organizations, local organizations, companies, and the federal government. Okay? So what I want to teach you today is maybe not how do you bring in $700,000 a year, but how do you bring in some money? Okay? When I started, I was hoping for sort of $20,000. So when I started, it was low end, and I knew nothing. Day one, I walked in as a professor, and 40% of my job was to bring money in. No one taught me how to do this. Where do you think you start? Any ideas where you start in this weird process of bringing in money? Research. What kind of research? We're going to go through 3 or 4 different steps of research. Oh, computer went to sleep. The first thing, you can start either by surfing the net, particularly grants.gov or philanthropic organizations, and seeing what kind of request for proposals that you want. So I have money from the United States Air Force, and they tell me exactly what they want me to do. Solve problem X. Please optimize the design of fluid flow through a chemical laser mixing nozzle. Very specific, right? And I may think about how one might do that and then write a proposal to them. Or what I'm going to present tonight is when you have a genius idea, which is more often than not, you think you have a genius idea, and you think somebody should pay you to pursue this genius idea. I would say at least 50% of my money falls into this realm, okay? So I've got a proposal that I recently submitted to the NSF, the National Science Foundation, of which I think I'm a genius to have developed, okay? The first, how did I come up with this idea? Mr. Tom Ankadoki, a professor at the School of Pharmacy over at CU Denver Health Sciences Center, we've been collaborating for about 8 years, and he sits down and he says, Kareen, we've been looking at shear stresses over particles and fluids. He said, I just suffered a heart attack, and I have absolutely no risk indicators in my heredity or in my chemical makeup. And it turns out that a significant number of the population, something like 40% of people, don't have any risk factors, yet suffer heart attacks. He said, well, heart attacks happen because of flow through arteries, and they create clots with their particles. Shouldn't we be able to solve this problem, Kareen? This sounds just like us. I said, genius, genius, I love it. Nothing happened for 6 months. We thought about it, you kind of read literature as you were going around and think about what you're doing. Well, what really happened was I was teaching a class in the area of artificial arteries, so arterial grafts. And this is where I really started to think about what was happening. So I read some papers, and I just want to go over some of the papers here. So what happens is, on the left-hand side, the top and the bottom, are a picture of cells in your artery where there's been a high shear stress, or the flow rate and the pulling on the cells is really high. And the first view is looking from above, and the second view is looking from the side. And you can see there's a lot of orientation. It's actually in the flow direction. The second picture is of a low shear stress situation. And so here the cells look rounder and there's more chaos. So clearly the flow, the shear stress of fluid blood on the cell changes the histology of the cells and the tissue. Well, that's exactly what I do. Excellent. I think I can keep pursuing this area. Okay? So I read more. I read a lot more. I read about 30 to 60 papers, all dated after probably 1995. All right? You think that's a lot of papers. I'm smart. I'm smart. I don't actually read them all in detail. How do you think I read them? I don't got a lot of time. I teach classes. I got $1 million in grants. I got 7 employees. I got a small baby. What do you think I'm doing? Oh, I wish I had that. If I'm going to write about it, I got to read it. There's something called review articles. So what I'll go through is through the history of a certain genre, flow through arteries. I will look for review articles. They probably turn up good ones once every 10 years. And I'll read them to get the history. And I'll read them in the order of their date, chronologically. And probably the last review article, if I'm lucky, was published 3 or 4 years ago. And then I'll have to read a bunch of papers for those 3 or 4 years to catch myself up, right? So really, I've only had to read maybe 10 to 15 papers to actually get the wealth of 60 to 70 papers. So it's intelligent, right? You'll do the same thing. What I find out is that no one understands how the cell senses the flow. Well, heck, I work in sensors, and I work in flow. This is genius, right? I can make money off of this. So I'm still motivated, but have no idea. So I call up Tom, and I tell him everything I've learned. And we start talking about things, and he says, hey, you know, I can make an artificial cell. It's called a model cell. And I said, really? Could you make rafts on those cells? So what are rafts? On the surface of any material, if you looked close enough through a microscope, you would see little microdomains. And these microdomains, many people think, change shape due to different chemical responses. Well, I thought to myself, why couldn't they change shape because of flow? Maybe they're sensors. So I go into the literature and I actually find people that say these little rafts are in fact sensors, but on osteocells, bone growth, and neural cells. No one's looked at it for blood cells. Genius! I'm still going to be the first. I love it, right? So I keep researching a little bit. What would be the engineering or scientific or physical foundation for this? And I formulate an idea. Now I can look for a place to fund me. I look around and I find that the NSF has a division on bioengineering and chemical transport, specifically have a division on biosensors, okay, and the complexities of biology. Perfect. Perfect. All right? Now I have to sit down and write. I got a genius idea. I think I'm going to actually figure out or prove that these little rafts, microdomains on cells, are going to be the signalers for blood flow changes, so plaques would begin to grow. We're actually going to look at them using a model cell, okay, and we can change the rafts chemically, and then look at lipoprotein absorption, which is the first step in plaques formation or thrombosis. Okay? I had to learn a lot of medical words before I wrote this proposal. So the next point I have to do is I need to sit down and write the background and significance. You live and die by these pages. This is about 2 pages. See how long is it in my proposal? 2 pages exactly. You live and die by this 2 pages. I have 15 pages to completely convince 15 people that they need to give me $500,000. Okay? In fact, the other 13 are meaningless. It's only the first 2. I have to make my entire sales pitch in 2 pages. My font's really small, as you can tell, and I use every inch of the margin. Okay? So the real key to proposal writing is being a salesman. being a salesman. When you're a scientist, no one taught you how to be a salesman. Okay? You have to be a salesman. And it comes down to the first 2 pages. So in those 2 pages, I must craft paragraphs and organize it such that I start off with the kick butt concept and then prove it through past literature that I have a high potential for success. If I achieve interest and belief that I could be successful, they may in fact read the next 13 pages. So I spend probably the most time on the first 2 pages, okay? What do you do after that? Well, you have to tell them what you've done with your past money and if you're worth spending money on, and how your past money actually relates to the current process, because they would like to know that you're not a joke, okay? So you have about 4 pages to do that. And it was just nice that I had to go get a new person to collaborate with, Dr. Yi. Dr. Yi is pretty cool. He can take an image of a cell and make a 3D topology of it. This is a nerve cell. And then he can apply some shear stresses and look at what microdomains change. Oh, very helpful, very helpful. Because now I can not only do the experimental with Tom on these model cells, but I can do the numerical. And so everybody's going to believe that I'm going to get great stuff out of this, okay? You're not done. You then have to tell them why you picked the people that you did pick, and you got to tell them exactly how you're going to do each experiment in excruciating detail. Because if they've gotten this far, this means that you're probably at the top 5, and they might only actually pick the top 2. It's about 10% funding rate out there. So you have to write in excruciating detail how you're going to do it. And if it doesn't work, what would I try? So I actually even have a section that is called pitfalls, right? Pitfalls and alternative plans. If I completely go down, this is what my alternative is. And what I'm trying to do is, if there's somebody really smart in the panel that might have tried this before and goes, oh, poppycock, you can't do that, he then might read this and say, okay, they've thought about how this might not work and they can do something about it. Okay? You also need to pay attention to your funding agency. What do they want? The NSF really wants me to do something more than research. They want me to educate people, okay, and reach out to people, especially high school students in high-risk communities. And so I talk about how this project could, or resources from this project could, be leveraged to those places. How long does it take to write one of these? When you first start, probably 30 days, non-stop work, 8 hours a day. Make a good one. When you've done it a few years, it took me about a week and a half working most of the way through the night. So it hasn't changed not a lot, maybe decreased by half, but it's very detail-oriented. So now let's give you the information that you really need. What do the reviewers do? So you mail it off, bye-bye, right? And then I go and review other people. So how does this work? Almost every situation, what they have is a panel of 5 to 14 panelists. They're experts who have been chosen based on the proposal that they come in and the topic areas. They pick people to come and comment. And you fly to Washington, D.C., or you fly to the company, or you fly somewhere. And you sit down, and you're supposed to have read these things before you arrive. And so if I go to NSF, I'm given 14 proposals, 15 pages each. I'm asked to read them in 2 weeks. Not going to happen. So you can understand that I'm reading 14 proposals in 2 weeks. I'm not reading the whole 15 pages. It's not possible given my job constraints. So I really am looking to triage them. I really am looking to, within the first 2 to 4 pages, decide if I'm going to read intensely or skim, as somebody said, the rest of the paper. Okay? When you get into the room, everybody's supposed to have read them. Maybe 3 people out of the 14 read them. And you talk about them. And one person may become the champion. Now, this person doesn't know you, because that would be illegal. Conflict of interest. This person champions you because they really believe in what you wrote. And they'll campaign for you within the community. And after 2 days, they'll come out with, out of sort of 30 maybe we read 30 proposals. We'll come out with 2, maybe 3 that we'll fund. It's a harsh world, right? So 27 other people who spent more than a month working on their proposal don't get any money. So you can tell why the first few pages are really important. Now you can do this for anything. This is a scientific example, but there's a professor in our department whose wife is an artist. She paints, and she frequently gains grants for artistic venues. She's very good at it, in fact. And so no matter what your background is, there are grants out there, humanities and all sorts of things, right? But no one ever talks to you about proposal writing. So research on where to find the money, research on whether your genius idea is really genius, research on whether somebody's actually interested in your idea, okay? Research on the methods of which you are going to demonstrate your success, research on the right people to connect yourself with the proposal to make it highly successful. So there's many levels of research here, not just one piece, not just the technical piece, it's the full aspect. Okay? How do you think you make something? Something sexy in the first few pages? Sexy enough that somebody will read on. Got any ideas? It's helpful to say it'll affect 1 million people per year, or 500,000 people per year. Right? Statistics are healthy. It's nice to be able to say, no one else has done it. Right? No one else has the capability of doing it. These are the things that you need to differentiate yourself from the rest of the pack, and you need to do it within the first couple pages. All right, I've talked enough. Anybody got any quick questions before I depart about proposal writing in general?
So did you get the proposal money?
This one takes about 6 months. NSF takes about 6 months, so I won't hear on this one until July.
Good luck.
Yeah, genius idea. Of the 6 I have outstanding, this is the one I think is most likely to get funded. That's why I presented it.
How many of these do you have out at one time?
This year's been a little bit insane. I've had up to 17 at one time out this year. But typically I try to write 6 to 10 a year. The funding rate is 10%, right? So you got to think about writing 10 a year to make sure you have 1. My research group has gotten a little bit too big, and so I need to write about 20 in order to make sure I've got enough funding to feed everybody.
What's the ratio of time you spend in the lab or doing this to writing?
So I don't actually spend any time in the lab anymore.
Okay.
My students ban me. When I was a young professor who only had to write, maybe I had no money and therefore I had no employees, I was probably spending 1 month, 2 months a year writing and 10 months a year in the lab. Now I got a team of about 7, and although I meet with each person for a half hour a week and then some other stuff, so maybe I'm putting in 2 days of effort with the students, I'm probably writing when I'm not in class, or thinking, generating ideas. Ideas is the hardest part. Once you get the idea, the writing comes pretty quick. I was a terrible writer. This gives you hope. When I was in 9th grade, I was actually on the standardized tests, scored at 1st grade spelling, 2nd grade reading. I bring $700,000 to $1 million just by writing. So you can change the way you write dramatically over a given space of time. All right.
And I think we should let you go home. Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Professor Tom Knecht from the Department of Political Science. Professor Knecht's research interests include American foreign policy and public opinion and the American presidency. And he's He's currently working on a book, and I jinxed him by asking him if he had a provisional title. But I won't jinx him further. But anyway, it's researching public opinion and foreign policy. He has taught service learning courses on American public opinion. He's worked closely with Project Homeless Connect. And as part of that work, he's been doing some research, some survey work on public opinion and the homeless. So I give you Professor Tom Connect.
Thank you. By the way, I should mention that I've brought in a total of 0 grants since I've been here at BU. I bring nothing to you. But Corinne was exactly right that grant writing is incredibly important, and there's a real skill to doing it and doing it well. And so I encourage you guys to think about what she said and become proficient grant writers. My research in political science and the social sciences in general is a little bit different. In some ways it's similar, in some ways it's different from the natural sciences. And I'm going to talk to you about one specific issue in quantitative research, and that is measurement. And I'm going to kind of introduce it by telling you one of our strongest theories in international relations. One of the very strongest theories that we have is that democracies do not fight wars with other democracies. All right, so if two countries are democratic, they're not going to go to war with each other. So we're not going to invade Canada anytime soon, even though they got it coming to them. So the question is, in order to test this hypothesis, we need to somehow come up with a measure of democracy and come up with a measure of war. So you can't just say, I know democracy when I see it. We have to put a code or a number by countries that are democratic and countries that aren't. So I'm going to ask you guys, how would you define a democracy? What are some indicators? Yes?
It's government by the people, so the people say who gets it, who goes in, who runs the government, etc.
Okay, so there has to be a vote. Okay, so if people can vote, that's a democracy. Anything else?
Equal representation.
Meaning?
People's rights are recognized and honored.
Okay, respect for individual rights, civil liberties. Okay, anything else? Yes?
Government is bound by its own laws.
Okay, rule of law, good. Anybody else? All right, so based on this definition, citizens have a right to vote, civil liberties, bound by the rule of law. When did the United States become a democracy? So, inception? 1965. 1920, when women got the right to vote. The definition is fundamentally ambiguous. We do not like ambiguous definitions when we come to quantitative research. We want firm measures of what a democracy is. Give you another example. Well, let me just kind of continue on this. How about war? How do we measure war? How many people need to be killed before it's considered a war? It's a difficult question. Much of quantitative research is actually, especially in social sciences, is coming up with firm measures of abstract concepts. In my own research, I'll give you 2 examples. My basic theory in the research that I'm looking at is that issue salience or public opinion influences governmental responsiveness. So when people are paying attention, politicians oftentimes do what we want them to do. When we're not paying attention, politicians don't have to do what we want them to do. All right? Everybody get the basic theory? Okay. How do you measure my key independent variable, issue salience? Any clues? I'll tell you how I measured it, and you tell me what's wrong with the measure. I measure issue salience by looking at television coverage of foreign policy events. So if the television, TV news is covering an event, my assumption is that then the issue is salient. they're not covering the event, it's not salient. Problems.
It depends on what demographic looks at what channel, what time of day, when, how, and who's presenting it. It's a woman or female commentator. There's so many variables, it's hard to explain.
Fantastic. So one critique is that people get their news from other sources, or they may not get their news at all. People may be militantly apolitical and they don't watch nightly news. Or you could get your news from the newspaper, from the internet. So there's one critique of my measure. Anybody else? Any other critiques?
Different networks get they get different policies. Like CNN is not like Fox.
Good.
Sometimes Fox shows you something that CNN won't show.
Good. Variation in the networks. So in my study, I only look at 3 networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. I don't look at CNN, I don't look at Fox, I don't look at MSNBC. So I have to answer that critique. Much of the work in social science, quantitative research, is telling what your measures are and justifying. So I have to do a ton of work before I can even test my hypothesis. I have to demonstrate that more people get their news from television than any other source, that the correlation between print media and televised media is fairly close. I have to basically provide a couple examples of when television didn't cover anything and people didn't pay attention. This is all very, very difficult to do. And it's something that we typically, I think students don't really think about, the measurement of their variables. They're more interested in the theory. And in academia, most of us come up with fairly plausible theories. And most of us run the analysis correctly. Where the bone is buried and where people will hammer you and critique you is in your measurement. You didn't measure democracy right. You didn't measure issue salience correctly. You didn't measure war correctly. Now, this is not just simply a purely academic exercise in going through measurement. How you measure things can make a huge difference in your outcomes. So let's go back to democratic peace. Democratic peace. No 2 democracies have ever fought a war. If you measure democratic peace by just simply giving people the vote, as they've done, the United States is democracy since its inception, and lo and behold, no 2 countries have ever gone to war that are democracies. And it's significant. It's a significant finding. But if we revise the measure and say, well, there has to be universal suffrage, so everybody gets a chance to vote. There has to be a rule of law. And when you include some of these other variables, the United States doesn't become a democracy until 1965. And lo and behold, the democratic peace is insignificant. You would expect that no 2 democracies would fight a war simply by random chance. So the conclusions that we draw from our analysis, from our measures, matter a lot. 2 final quick points, and then I'll turn it over, is that when students write a quantitative research paper for me, they oftentimes do not explain how they measured the variables. They also do not justify their measures. Why is this the right measure to use? How might using a different measure lead to different conclusions? So when you're writing a quantitative research paper, make sure that you have a section that's called methods. In the methods section, you want to do a couple things. You want to tell other people how you conducted the study so they can replicate it. A foundation of scientific knowledge is replication, that other people should be able to take our same data, the same things that we're looking at, and come up with the same conclusion. And we have to walk them through step by step. I did it like this, I measured it like that, this is what I did, and these are the analyses I've done. The second thing that you have to do is to think about the measures that you used and play devil's advocate. If I was going to critique my own paper, how would I critique critique this particular major? And I might come up with a couple different things. So I thought about the fact that Americans might get their news from other sources. I also thought about the fact that I don't have CNN and MSNBC in there, and they might be different. So how do I answer that? And I spent a ton of time in my book answering those critiques and establishing that my major is a valid major. Oftentimes, students write a paper and they see a weak spot in their own work. Rather than acknowledging the weak spot, dealing with it, they try to hide it. They don't mention it. Well, if I mention it, then my paper's weaker. No, make sure that you're upfront. Here's the weakness of the major. Here's how it could affect results. But here's my justification why I'm going to use it anyhow. So that's all I have.
We'll have an opportunity for questions or comments for Tom in just a little bit, but let me introduce our third speaker so we can get everything out on the floor here. This is my colleague Richard Colby from the writing program. Richard's primary research is in composition theory, pedagogy, and writing studies, but he's currently researching how computer games inform literacy and its teaching. To those ends, he's co-authored an essay on World of Warcraft, and he's a guest editor of a special issue of a journal called Computers and Composition Online about games and game theory. So, Richard Colby.
I'm doing this without notes tonight, just because my wife said I'd better if I'm not reading. So, let me talk today about quantitative research in my field. But I'm going to actually begin with my thesis. For those people that are writing their summary or critique for the classes, I'm going to begin with my thesis. And that is, any topic, anything that you're studying, whatever it is, can be studied and researched from these three research traditions that we're talking about in your WRIT 1133 class. So there's interpretive, there's a qualitative, and a quantitative. Okay? So, any topic can be looked at from that perspective. And for example, I'm going to take an astronomy example. There's two reasons why I take astronomy example. But the one is because we think of astronomy as very scientific, very quantitative. But you can actually look at astronomy throughout our own history as coming at it or researching at it from these three different research traditions. For example, originally, we can imagine people studying it from an interpretive sense, looking up at the stars and seeing, what do these stars mean? What do they mean to me? And trying to connect the stars with our human experience. Okay? But another way we can do it is that idea of qualitative. And remember, qualitative research is, not necessarily testing hypothesis, but describing something, trying to create patterns for something. And qualitatively, we have a lot of early quote-unquote researchers who were creating patterns of the stars and basically describing them in great detail. And then eventually we have the technology to measure the stars. We measure the light, we can measure that through radio waves. So you can take something very scientific, which we imagine only quantitative research giving us any information, but we can also look at interpretively and qualitatively. Now you might be thinking to yourself, I've got a degree in rhetoric and composition, what am I doing talking about astronomy? Well, I do it because most of you probably have never considered quantitative research from that perspective of rhetoric and composition. Let me talk about those two terms in my degree and a little bit about my background and how it applies to you. The first thing is rhetoric, as you may or may have heard in your class. We probably have a lot of definitions, but let's just talk about it as the art of persuasive communication. So we have rhetoric as a study of how people communicate and how that also transfers into writing. And composition, in some ways, is the type of writing you do in the class, but composition as a discipline, as a degree, often accounts for teaching students how to write. So we might think about the effect of writing and also the teaching of writing to students. And that is what my degree is in. As you can imagine, though, there's not a lot of quantitative research that's often discussed in those forums. And I might make you think about the fact, have you ever, say, counted how many sentences you have in your essays? Anybody done anything like that? Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy tough, right? And in fact, there was a time in the history of rhetoric and composition where researchers have said, you know what, let's count how many words or how many syllables are in a sentence to see if we can say that this is good writing versus there's not enough syllables or there's not enough words in this sentence and this is bad writing. There was this whole sort of movement idea of what are called T units, in which case we're going to count all the words in our main clauses and all the subordinating clauses and say, that's good writing. This over here with very few is unsophisticated, bad writing. So how can we get students doing this bigger writing? Except, I can bet you imagine that you've probably read something that you really enjoyed, that was really good, that didn't necessarily have really long sentences, right? Probably. So that kind of falls by the wayside because some of this quantitative research doesn't really work out that well. So one of the things in studying writing from a quantitative sense is that you also have to think about it pragmatically. You have to also think about it from that composition standpoint. On one hand, we can judge good writing in all these quantitative measures, but on the other hand, you have to think to yourself, how can I teach this to students? For example, we have research that talks about meta-discourse. And what meta-discourse is talking about how you, as a writer, lead the reader through your essay. Easy stuff like the first way, the second way. The first way, this room is huge, or not very conducive to education, I guess, if you want to put it that way, is X. X being whatever your claim is, okay? So we have meta-discourse. We have all these studies of meta-discourse that basically say 40% of texts in professional and academic settings is meta-discourse at that level, okay? 20% of the text, the entire text of all the words, are what are called qualifications. Qualifications basically say, rather than say, this room is not conducive to an educational setting, it's saying, this room is not conducive to most educational setting, that idea of qualification. So 60% of the language in academic and professional types of writing have already been decided for you. So you might think to yourself, well, that might be a way to judge writing or grade writing, or in other words, we might think of it from a teaching standpoint. How can I say, well, in writing in this rhetorical situation, understand that qualification becomes important if it's 20% of your text, or meta-discourse becomes important because it's 40% of your text. In other words, certain rhetorical situations call for certain practices as far as your writing is concerned, okay? So quantitative research as far as teaching is concerned, it's a way to inform the types of writing, the type of rhetorical situations that we sort of discuss. One last thing as far as that quantitative research goes and that teaching of it, both of the previous presenters have talked about the absence or of the fact that didn't have any lessons on writing a proposal, or that idea of wishing that more students would write about their measures and define their terms. So one of the things that we attempt to do in the program, and Rails really believe in this, is the idea of presenting, like we do in these lectures, qualitative, quantitative, and interpretive research, to give you all experience in practicing these different research methodologies. And because I feel strongly about it as a teacher, and I know those of my students that are here tonight recognize that they have to write that survey group report, where they have to conduct the survey and write the methodology section and write about the different measures that they're going to be looking at. And I think that's an important step in using quantitative research not only to teach writing, but to teach quantitative research to students. So that's what I have.
Open up for questions here. A quick observation that I had that goes to the heart of much of what Tom was talking about and relates to Richard. I got to DU just about 2 years ago, and one of the things that I heard people say, I'd meet with groups of faculty and they'd say, well, you know, all of this writing stuff is fine, but, you know, my students can't write a single decent sentence. And I thought, no, that doesn't really square with my experience. I've read a lot of DU student writing, and it actually looks pretty good to me, but I kept hearing this enough. And so I finally thought, well, shoot, I'm tired of this. We're going to do an empirical study. We're going to look at the errors per sentence and come up with a figure. And actually, the figure is about 89% of your sentences are just perfectly fine. But the problem of what counts as an error, and we just had, you know, hours and hours of meetings. You know, how do we classify this? What counts? And then you would think something like, what counts as a sentence? You know, what could be clearer? You know, and punctuation. Even that becomes tricky. So just to let you know that we've struggled with these things too. Anyway, I'm going to shut up, and I'll if I need to moderate, I will. But otherwise, throw out your question, and if it's to a certain person, ask them.
Tom, I was wondering how you would define war.
It's not my definition. It is actually this is a big data set. It's called the Correlates of War data set. This is where they kind of came up with the idea of the democratic peace. They define war as 1,000 battlefield deaths between two sovereign nations. So what that excludes is if 999 people die, it's not a war. And if it is civil war, an armed incursion by some domestic group, that does not count either. And a lot of people objected to those points. Why 1,000? Seems arbitrary. Why does a civil war not count as a war in the United States? If we count the Civil War, then democracies have gone to war with other democracies. So most of the critiques of democratic peace theory lie on the measures rather than the hypothesis itself.
Okay.
Yes?
If you're, say, writing within the community that, you know, like here's the democratic peace policy or the theory, would you necessarily have to defend the reason that you use the measures you do, or if you're writing about a subject that your measurement is definitely, or is generally agreed upon by your audience, do you have to defend yourself, or is it more just stating what measurement you use for clarification?
I mean, it's a really good question. It depends. It depends on what kind of critiques you think you're going to get. If you think somebody's going to hold you over the coals about your definition of democracy or war, then you have to justify it. If it's a well-established justification and measure for a concept, then you just refer to that person or whoever established that in your methods section. I'll give you an example. Political tolerance is really difficult to measure. Tolerance. What does it mean to be tolerant of somebody else? If you guys were going to have to make an operationalization of that variable, what would you say?
Accepting somebody's views that are different than yours?
Okay. Accepting meaning what?
Allowing them to hold their own views regardless of how they compare to your own.
Okay. What about teaching at a college? Would you accept, think of your most hated group. Would you accept them teaching at your college at DU?
Well, if you're going to be tolerant.
Okay, so that's one definition came up by, I think Schneiderman developed them back in the 70s. Everybody uses that. And it goes like this. They ask people in public opinion polls, who's your least liked group? And you might say, you know, I don't know, communist or terrorist or whatever. And they would say, would you be willing to allow that group to speak in public, to hold marches, to teach at your university? And they create kind of a composite measure of those answers, and that is political tolerance. All right? Now that's pretty well established as one definition of political tolerance, and so you don't have to go through that whole thing again. You just say, I'm going to use this accepted definition. Here's a citation. But if you're going to come up with a new one, then you definitely have to go through the justification.
You mentioned generating measurements about ambiguous ideas. How would you go about doing that?
I'll give you another example. Another strong theory in political science is that when the economy is doing well, that the incumbent president tends to win re-election. All right? So when things are going good, we all have money in our pocket, we win re-election, or the incumbent does. When things aren't going well, the incumbent loses. So the economy, everybody throws it around, but it's really an abstract concept. And so you as a researcher come up with this great hypothesis. The economy equals or leads to re-election. Then you have to think, if I'm going to measure the economy, what measure makes the most sense? All right, what would you guys think? What are some different measures of the economy?
Stock market?
Stock market, good. So we can look at the Dow Jones average. That's available, yes?
Mortgage rates?
Mortgage rates, good.
Job employment.
Unemployment,
Whether or not the disposable income is growing.
disposable income, GDP, purchasing power parity. There are tons of different measures for the economy. And it's your job as a researcher then to think about which one makes the most sense. Because somebody's going to come along, replicate your study, use a different measure, and say your conclusions are all wrong. When we use GDP instead of unemployment rates, the relationship totally drops away. All right? So you really need to think about why GDP, if you're going to use that as your measure, is the right one to use. It's really, it takes a lot of thought into how to measure. I want to mention one more thing dealing with computer gaming. There's a really interesting study concerning measurement. Somebody was wondering, well, this is when the SARS epidemic was going around, and they thought, well, what if we had like a worldwide epidemic? What would people do? If people were just dropping dead all over the place, how would people likely react? Now, you can't really measure that directly because it's pretty unethical to introduce a virus that kills a lot of people. And so what they did is actually look at online games where people create a character and that's their character. In these games, I forget which one it was, but they have viruses that go around that kill off people. And they looked to see how the gamers reacted when their character became infected. All right, and they found some really interesting things. They found a certain personality type ran into town and tried to infect as many people as he could before he died. They found that most people, though, kind of went out in the woods so they wouldn't infect anybody and just died by themselves there. And I found this to be a really ingenious study. You can't measure it directly, so what's the best thing that we can do? Well, look at online gaming. The obvious critique is, hey, that's not realistic. Gaming's one thing, actually having the SARS virus and dying is another one. And the researchers had a pretty good rebuttal to that. They said that the people that play these games are so wrapped up in the games, and the character really becomes part of their life, that they behave as if they had the virus.
And it was actually, just piggyback off that, it actually was World of Warcraft. And what made it interesting was they studied it from the fact that the virus was a bug in the game. People weren't supposed to be able to take this disease out of a particular area, and they were able to take this virus into the main cities. And that's why it became this interesting thing, because it was purely accidental. It was purely like, oh no, what's happened? And that's why the study came about. It was sort of an after the fact.
And then how do you account for I think there's at that level a certain personality type that gets really into those kinds of games. So how would you account for that in the real world?
In the real world? I don't know. This is outside my area. Here's kind of a not very satisfying response to your very intelligent question is that, especially in social sciences, our majors stink. They're not really good, all right? And so we sometimes have to come up with a justification that that's the best we have, you know, and that's that. Along those lines, and this is one thing that I hope you guys all take away from not only the measurement, but also from my talk, is that the social sciences differ from the natural sciences when it comes to how good our theories are. Natural sciences can come up with laws. So if this, then that. A always leads to B. In the social sciences, we do not have such laws. Natural sciences is deterministic. Social sciences is probabilistic. So, if I said, well, you know, Democrats typically vote for the Democratic presidential candidate. That's a probabilistic statement. I might be right 92% of the time, but there's always somebody out there who's a Democrat that votes for George W. Bush. So even the very best theories that we have are probabilistic, they're not deterministic. What that means for you as writers is that when you're writing in the social sciences, avoid words that are absolute. Always, never, prove, disprove. Instead, you provide evidence for or evidence against a hypothesis. Nothing can ever conclusively be proved or disproved in the social sciences. Does that make sense?
Is there one more question? Up in the corner.
I was wondering to hear a little bit more about your research methodology.
Which part of it?
I don't know, we got like a brief sentence on what you do provide, just like a little bit.
Are you going to talk about World of Warcraft? Is that?
Yeah.
I'll talk about World of Warcraft and actually how my entire pedagogy is informed. It's sort of similar across my classes, but specifically in World of Warcraft. We have lots of developmental research about students as writers, okay? In other words, we know that you can write. You're at the university. You're obviously writers, okay? But what we try to do, what I try to do as a teacher is move past just being able to write, what's called that idea of that behavioral expertise, what Annette Karmeloff-Smith talks about, behavioral expertise, and moving into what's called representational redescription. The RR thing always screws me up. So in other words, that stage of representational redescription is that idea of critical reflection, that you're conscious of what you're doing. You're not just doing it because somebody told you to do it, but you're doing it because, hey, here's a rhetorical situation. I don't know what is expected of me except of these various expectations from outside, but I don't know how to do it. In other words, nobody taught me how to write X, but because I understand how writing works, because I understand a rhetorical situation, I can enter this new situation and be able to write in this new situation. So in that World of Warcraft class, how Rebecca and I sort of theorize that class is it's more about coming into the situation and understanding that students know how to write, and A and B, students know how to play World of Warcraft. We're not teaching students how to play World of Warcraft, but they're going and saying, here's a rhetorical situation. There's something that's confusing about game players, or there's something that's confusing about gameplay, and I have to generate this research question. Pick the best research methodology, pick the best type of writing that addresses that, okay? And so in that way, what we're finding out is how students take that rhetorical situation and are able to formulate hypothesis, formulate a research plan, formulate a writing plan, as opposed to Rebecca and I just saying, okay, do X, Y, and Z, go on to the next assignment. And so as far as development of learning, you are all at that stage, and we're actually seeing how students are able to navigate that stage. Okay? Did that answer that? Okay.
I am certain that these folks would stay around for a few minutes if you wanted to ask them a question or make a comment individually, just come down. But otherwise, thanks so much for coming. And I think